There we go. So it's now recording, and I'm going to ask Dylan first, if he'd like to introduce himself.
Happy to do so. So I'm Dylan Owen. I work for Social Services, Head of Commissioning in Powys County Council. And thanks for the invite and for the welcome. I think Michael's going to provide the updates rather than myself, and so I'll heckle from the background if that's okay, and hand you over to Michael.
Diolch yn fawr, Dylan. Michael, if I can come to you, please.
Yeah, certainly. Afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Gray. I'm Head of Adult Services here at Powys County Council, and really happy to be here this afternoon to discuss our current situation with regards to day services and day centres in Powys. And as Claire says, I understand that this is first of a number of opportunities for us to share our views around day services and the future of them. And we're more than happy to be part of future discussions as well. Before I provide a brief chronology of events up to where we are now, I would like, if possible, that when we do enter into discussions, if we can slightly reframe the discussion so that we don't just focus on the reopening of buildings-based support, which is undoubtedly important, but that we also consider other community-based day opportunities that maybe we've learned we could do more of or differently as a result of our learnings during the pandemic. And certainly some of these opportunities may become more feasible as lockdown restrictions are eased further. So to provide you with a brief timeline so you understand where we've come from and where we've got to, if we cast our minds back to mid-March 2020, we invoked business continuity in adult services and across the whole local authority. And that resulted in us within a week closing our day centres for older people and our day services for individuals with disabilities. We very rapidly redeployed staff to other settings. In some cases, that was around supported living settings. In other cases, that was about utilising those staff who were initially working in these centres to undertake more outreach type provision. And this was all trying to make sure that there was continuity of support so that individuals still had their eligible needs met. We then undertook a risk assessment, and this risk assessment was based on guidance that was suggested by the Social Care Institute for Excellence. It was another local authority who had compiled this risk assessment template. And we undertook that risk assessment in July 2020, and that resulted in a portfolio holder decision that concluded that it wasn't possible to reopen day services and day centres safely in Powys at that time, and that outcome would remain the position whilst physical, social distancing, PPE, hygiene guidance remained in place. And we made a decision at that point that those buildings should remain closed for a further 6 months. And that took us up to the 12th of February of this year, 12th of February 2021. And we said in that report that any decision to reopen these day centres or day services would need to take place following another review of the current risk assessment. We did undertake another risk assessment in February of this year, and we concluded at that point that it still wasn't viable to open up those buildings after that initial 6-month time period. And so a decision was made for those services to remain closed until August the 12th of this year. Now, as we all know, the situation has been very changeable. At the point that we undertook that revised risk assessment, we'd actually ramped up, or Welsh Government had ramped up the lockdown levels. I think we found ourselves at a level 4. And if you recall, there was a fire break period where the restrictions were even more severe than before. At this point in time, we've moved from that level 4 down to a level 2. And our provider services have, in the background, they've been continuing to focus on exploring recovery-based opportunities and making sure that they're maintaining that outreach provision, whilst making sure that those that have been redeployed to the domiciliary care in-house team are continuing to do that as well. So in terms of the mechanics of determining how and when we can open up these settings again, there's a number of different considerations at play here. And I suppose the main ones that I wanted to discuss this afternoon would be around staff, around premises and transport, and around social distancing. So in terms of staff, first of all, due to vacancies, due to staff being deployed elsewhere, due to some staff still shielding as a result of the COVID regulations, there is clearly an issue around staffing capacity to support the same number of staff, the same number of individuals that were being supported through day centres and day services at pre-pandemic levels. We've done quite a lot of analysis to try and determine what we could feasibly do, bearing in mind that there's still business critical activities that we need to make sure we continue to deliver as well. In terms of premises and transport, we've undertaken property specific risk assessments for each one of our buildings, and there is clearly capacity issues here as well if you consider the fact that within each of these buildings we still need to abide by social distancing guidelines, and that therefore has an impact on the number of individuals that we would be able to support in each and every one of those buildings. And in terms of social distancing, it's difficult at this point in time to identify an easy way where we could reopen all those day centres or day services when we consider that there are still restrictions on shared transportation to and from those centres, which many of our residents relied upon to get them to and from those settings beforehand. And that's obviously compounded by staff who have been redeployed to other settings continuing to provide care to people at home, and therefore not being immediately available to open and be part of the opening of a day centre or day service for a smaller group. So that's why I think what we've been doing really since we closed these day centres, and it's very much a continual conversation, is having the right what matters conversations with the right people. So making sure that the support that people received pre-pandemic, prior to the 16th of March, is still the requirement now. And if any needs have changed, that we know about it and that we can update care and support plans as a result of that. We also don't want to make assumptions that everybody would wish to return to a day service or a day centre, because we know that there have been some people who have found other ways of spending their time during the pandemic for as long as those buildings-based opportunities have been closed. So to just give you an idea of the numbers, in March 2020, pre-pandemic, the day centres were providing support to 154 older people with 33 staff. And in terms of disability services provision, that was 124 people being provided with support with 70 frontline staff. So that's about 278 people in total. In the current climate, based on the staff that we've got to potentially draw upon, the services could support a maximum of about 100 people. And that excludes the outreach and the responding to need of ongoing domiciliary care that many of those staff have been deployed to at this point in time. So I suppose what I would be really interested in having a discussion about with you all this afternoon is, bearing in mind that context, bearing in mind the aspirations that day services and day centres should be a mechanism for people to connect with one another, to guard against loneliness and social isolation. How can we work together to identify whether there's any other opportunities that we can develop or build upon together? So are there, for example, community activities that have started kind of organically developing that we can support in developing further? Are there opportunities around supported employment, for example, for individuals that maybe haven't considered that before? And before we move into a wider discussion, I think the principle for me here is that any future decisions that we do make should be about not just treating people as passive recipients of services, but trying to do what we can to draw upon people's innate interests, their skills and their knowledge, so that there's a real equal partnership in determining what the future of day opportunities look like in Powys. I'm not going to go into any more detail just now. This is very much your time, so I'm happy to open this up to a wider conversation now, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you've got, as will Dylan and other colleagues that we've got on the call from the council. If there's any more detailed questions that we don't quite have the answers to this afternoon, we'll endeavour to go away and find out those answers for you and then report back. Thank you.